Morning. Well, good to see you guys. If we haven't met before, I'm Trevor. I'm one of the pastors here at Beacon, and I'm excited to be here today to continue on our Scenes series where we're discussing the parables of Jesus. And this morning, I want to just take a few minutes to talk about value. Value is one of these things that I find really interesting because it's always relative. Value by nature is comparative. To determine the value of one thing, you have to just kind of hold it up against something else and determine, which is greater than or less than. In the olden days, they used to barter for things, and so you'd bring your bucket of goat milk, and you'd see how many things of corn you can get for your bucket of goat milk, and the value of one would be determined by the other, and it was this comparison that was made. And in our modern civilization, Western society, we have the dollar, and the dollar is kind of our attempt to create a baseline for value, because no matter where you go, a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. It's always 100 cents, and yet even the value of a dollar fluctuates, and it varies, and it adjusts. The value of the dollar rises and falls in the global economy. I don't know if you guys know this day is Chris's birthday. Piano playing Chris. Yeah. Happy birthday, Chris. I heard that when Chris was a kid, he could go to the movies. It only cost him a nickel. Yeah. Yeah, they called it a picture show back then, and it was black and white and grainy. And now you go to the movies and you have to break the bank in order to go, because the value of a dollar has changed over time. And we who live in New York, we know that the value of a dollar is different here in New York than say in other parts of the country. If you go to one of those really flat states in the middle, the ones that we fly over, and you want to buy a house, you could do so for the cost of an SUV. It's really crazy. I was on Zillow the other day. You guys know what Zillow is? Zillow.com. It's this real estate site where you can, it's pretty cool. You just search anywhere in the U.S. and start clicking on homes, and it'll give you the estimated value. So if you really want to get depressed about your life, pull up one of these Midwestern states and start clicking on homes, because there was one that I pulled up. It was $60,000 for a real house, not something falling apart. It wasn't even a handyman special or anything like that. There's another one, and it was a 3,500 square foot house, acres of land for $140,000, and it's just crazy. Or we're crazy, I don't know. But the value of a dollar, it varies from one place to the next. It's not always equal. And when we are discussing value, it's always relative. It's always comparative in nature. And even a dollar sign is just a symbol. The only signs that really carry weight when it comes to value are these three signs: less than, greater than, or equal to. Those are the only signs that carry true weight when it comes to the discussion of value. And you go to the Midwest, and $140,000 equals a decent house. You come to New York, and $140,000 equals a down payment on the same house. And it changes over time, and it's subjective, but it's always comparative. You always need to have two things, and you're saying that this is equal to this. That's kind of our understanding of value. So the question that I have to ask today is, if value is always comparative, if it's always relative like this, then where does our value come from? I think it's natural for people to compare themselves to one another. If you're anything like I am, when somebody walks into the room, I almost unconsciously, I see them and I kind of size them up and I figure out, how I measure up to them and they to me, and it almost happens in a split second. And I probably don't labor over it for too long all the time, but, other times maybe I'll spend more time thinking about how I compare to somebody. But comparing ourselves to one another, I think is a very natural reaction. And it's almost a reaction. It's not something that we do consciously. And I think it's so pervasive for people to compare themselves to one another because this is where we find our value. Our value is always, like anything else, it's comparative. How do we measure up to the next guy? How do you measure up to the person sitting next to you? Are you less than, greater than, or equal to? I mean, dads, think about it for a second. Imagine if you fathers out there, there's a few of you, if you find out that, the dad up the street and the dad across the street and the dad right next door, all these dads, that they're doing quite well. And, for Christmas, they were able to get their kids everything that they wanted and more. And you find out that, next week for winter break, they're taking their kids on this, awesome vacation. And imagine that you weren't. This year was a little tighter. You had to skim back a little bit on Christmas. And, you're trying to sell your family the idea of a staycation next week for winter break because, you just can't afford it this time around. How does it feel to be in that position? How do you feel like you measure up to these other dads? Or ladies, how do you feel when your friend who eats everything that she wants and she's never seen a gym before and she couldn't tell you what salad tastes like and yet she's still a size 2 and you've gone up 2 dress sizes in the last 6 months? Like, how did that make you feel? How do you feel like you measure up compared to this person? Or, all the single ladies out there, you have that friend who is beautiful and charming and charismatic and, she dates a different guy every week and you haven't had a serious date in like a year. How does it make you feel when you compare your life to hers? How do you feel like you measure up? It's hard for us to not feel like our value is in question when we see things going well in somebody's life and not so well in our own. And it's a driving force for us, I think, to strive to distinguish ourselves from other people, to make sure that our situation is good, because we find our value in our situations. And fortunately, when we compare ourselves to Jesus' disciples, we're not so bad. They struggled with this same sort of idea of trying to compare themselves to other people and finding their value in their situation versus other people's situation. If you have a Bible and you want to open up to Matthew 20, verse 1, we're going to look at a parable called the workers in the vineyard. It's often how it's referred to. And whenever you're looking at a parable or really any teaching in Scripture, context is crucial. We always have to kind of understand what comes before and what comes after. Very rarely is there an idea in Scripture that's just like an isolated thought that is not related to what comes before or after. So I want to kind of paint this scene a little bit for you so you can understand where Jesus is coming from when he begins telling his disciples this parable. So it's late in Jesus' ministry, and his disciples have been kind of with him for 2-3 years at this point. They gotten to see all the cool things that he's doing and be a part of it. And now, one day, Jesus is sitting there and he's teaching, and all these annoying little kids keep trying to crowd around him. And the disciples understand that Jesus is the Son of God, and this is no place for children. And so they're trying to, push the kids away and like, all right, get away, get out of here, get out. And Jesus stops them and says, no. Let these little kids come to me. And he says that the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. It belongs to these children. And the disciples are like, all right, that's weird. In our society, we worship our children. But back then, that was not true. Kids were second rate. So for Jesus to say this, it kind of gets the disciples thinking. And then immediately after this wealthy, successful man comes up to Jesus. And he says to Jesus, look, I have followed the whole law. I've been, striving to do everything right. He says, what can I do to be a part of this kingdom. And there's this back and forth. You can go look at it later. But eventually this man walks away feeling dejected and feeling like he doesn't belong. And so the disciples are sitting there and they're questioning, like, all right, wait a minute. So the snot-nosed little kids, they're in the kingdom, but the wealthy religious guy who's trying to do everything right, not so much. And he gets them thinking, and so Peter, he pops up and he's like, excuse me, Jesus, just question. So me and the guys here talking, we left everything behind to come follow you. We have nothing, What does that mean for us? And this is the question that Peter asks. He says, what is it going to mean for us? Where do we fall in line in this value system that you're talking about in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus answers him in two ways. He kind of gives him two answers. And the first is the answer that Peter wants. He turns to Peter and he says, man, when I come back and I renew all things, you guys are going to reign in glory with me, and it's going to be amazing. And anybody who's given up anything, family or homes or property or possessions, you're going to get it back 100-fold, which is weird to think about, getting 100-fold of your family. But that's what Jesus promised. And so, the disciples are excited. Oh, this is great. And then Jesus says something. He says, the first will be last, and the last will be first. And then he begins to tell this parable. And he says in Matthew 20, beginning in verse 1, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 a.m, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace and doing nothing. And he told them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. And he went out again about noon and about 3 p.m. and did the same thing. About 5 p.m, he went out and found it still others standing around. And he asked them, 'Why have you been standing here all day long, doing nothing?' And they replied, 'No one has hired us,' they answered. He said to them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first.' The workers who were hired about 5 p.m. came, and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. 'These who were hired last worked only an hour,' they said, 'and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day.' But he answered one of them, 'I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give to the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?' And Jesus says again, 'So the last will be first, and the first will be last.'" Imagine being one of these workers who was hired at the beginning of the day. And you're going to go for your 12-hour shift. You're going to go and do your manual labor, and you're going to get a denarius, which is a normal day's wage. And so this is okay, And you start working, and then when you start seeing these other guys come in, and you're like, all right, they're working too. All right, this is good. Relieve me a little bit. And then some other guys come in, and you're like, all right. And then the end of the day comes, and the foreman comes to pay you, and he starts with the guys who are hired last. So they've only been working for about an hour, and he pays them a denarius. And you can only imagine, they see this at first, and they're probably thrilled. Like, dude, we hit the jackpot. Drinks are on me tonight. This guy is, he might have said we're going to get a denarius, but if he's giving them a denarius, he's got to give us 12. And then the next guy gets paid, and they are a little confused by it. They're like, he probably didn't have change for a denarius, and so he just gave him a denarius. All right, I get it. But then the next guy comes along, and he gets a denarius as well, and now they're really getting confused and concerned about the whole situation. And then the next guy comes, and now they're upset, and finally he comes along, and he pays them, and they're just outraged. How could you give them as much as you're giving us? They're offended by it. Because when he's giving the people who are hired last a denarius for 1 hour's wage, he's essentially saying that this guy's 1 hour is worth as much as all 12 of your working hours. It's an offense to them because they see it as a value statement, that this guy is worth more than you are. You have to give 12 of yourself to equal one of these guys. It's insulting. It's an offense. Imagine, for instance, you found out that one of your coworkers who does the same job that you have, has the same title that you have, has been with a company for the same amount of time as you have, was making 20% more than you. How would that feel? You'd be really excited about it, I'm sure. No, but you would interpret it as a value statement. Your boss obviously values this person more than they value you. You know, it's funny because we live in America and it's this really progressive society, and yet still in 2013, on average, women made 10 to 20% less than men did working the same job. If you're a woman, this should outrage you. This is offensive. They're saying that women aren't as valuable as men in the workplace, and it's right for you to be offended. When I was growing up, I'm the youngest of four. Anybody else the youngest in the family? All right, we got to stick together. Being the youngest has its perks, its pros, but there are also its cons. I'm the youngest of four, and at the top of the food chain is my oldest brother, Jason, and then less than 2 years behind him is my brother, Jeremy. They were really close in age and close to each other growing up. A few years behind them was my sister, Tracy, and then comes me a few years behind her. And so my brothers, because they were so close in age and everything, they were often viewed as a unit, and they were called the boys. Jason and Jeremy were the boys, and there was Trevor and Tracy, and some of you are like, that makes so much sense about why Trevor is the way he is. But I always knew that when they were referred to the boys, they weren't talking about me. They were talking about Jason and Jeremy. And the boys always got to do all these fun, cool things that I wasn't allowed to do because they were so much older than me. My parents learned this lesson early on because they were, when I was about 1.5 years old, my brothers decided that it would be fun to jump off the toy box. And I wanted to jump off the toy box too. And so they helped me climb up, and I jumped off and broke my ankle. So my parents knew that I couldn't run with the big dogs. So very often, the boys had access and opportunities that I didn't. You know, the boys had matching BB guns. I didn't. I had like a Nerf gun, not as cool. The boys had 10-speed bikes. I had a trike, not as cool. You know, the boys had the freedom to go ride around their bikes and shoot their BB guns, and I didn't. Even their chores were cooler. Like on Saturday mornings, they'd be outside. They get to ride on the lawnmower and like cut wood with an axe, like really manly stuff. And I'd be in the house with my sister dusting and vacuuming. And it wasn't fair. But as a kid, obviously my parents had reasons for all these decisions and everything. But I would get so upset sometimes because my brothers would have these opportunities that I wouldn't. And I would look, and in my mind we're the same. So if they're able to do it and I'm not, what does that say about me? And it wasn't just about like not getting my way, but every time I would cry out to them, why can they do it and not me? It was a value statement in my mind. For all I could tell, my parents just liked my brothers more than me. Obviously, you know, my parents had reasons. They wanted to protect me and everything like that. But in that moment, I couldn't help but feel, why them and not me? There must be something wrong with me. And I think the temptation to come to God in this same way is so real. You know, when you look and you see that your neighbor is driving the car that you've always wanted, it's easy to say, why them and not me? Or you see that girl with the perfect body, and ladies, you're like, why her and not me? Or, you know, you lose your job, but your coworker gets to keep it, and you're like, why me and not him? Or you lose somebody who's important to you, and you say, God, why am I the one who's losing out here and not them? God, when am I going to catch my break? It's easy to, in these moments, feel like we're less valuable to God. Like our worth is in question. And so Jesus, he tells this parable to his disciples to get them to realize that our system of value, the system of comparison that we use to determine value, it's not welcome in the kingdom of heaven. It's not how things work in the kingdom of heaven. He says, in my kingdom, the last are first, the first are last. All of this process that we use comparing to one another, it's not going to be in my kingdom, he says. And it's poisonous. And we can see if you go to verse 15. The workers are grumbling. And the landowner, he responds to them, he says, I have the right to do what I want with my own money. And he says, or are you envious because I am generous? Are you envious because I am generous? In the original Greek, the literal translation here is your eye evil because I am good? Is your eye evil because I am good? This system of comparison that we use to find our value, this is what it does. This is how poisonous it is. It actually can take something that God is doing that is good, and it pollutes our minds so we understand it as evil or bad. In James chapter 3, it says, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, don't boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom doesn't come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. This system of comparison that we use, it feeds into envy and selfish ambition. And James says that this kind of wisdom, it doesn't come from heaven. This is unspiritual, earthly, and demonic, and it brings about evil and disorder. It might seem pretty innocent to, sit back and just kind of be comparing ourselves to one another and sizing each other up and trying to find our value here. But James says it's evil, and it just brings disorder. And we can see why. There's a few different reasons why this system of comparison is so dangerous. The first is that it eats away any sense of community that we can have. There's this study done by a Harvard professor of psychology, and this is what he writes. It says, to be considered a great driver, lover, or chef, we simply need to part, kiss, and bake better than most other folks do. How do we know how well other folks are doing? Well, we look around, of course. And if we can't find people who are doing more poorly than we are, we may go out and create them. Volunteers in one study took a test and were then given the opportunity to provide hints that would either help or hinder a friend's performance on the test. And although volunteers helped their friends when the test was described as a game, it says they actively hindered their friends when the test was described as an important measure of intellectual ability. Once we've successfully sabotaged their performances and ensured their failure, they become the perfect standard for our competition. This is crazy, and I hope to God that if I was in this situation, that I wouldn't be one of these people that would actively be hindering my own friends just so I could look better in comparison. And yet, part of me fears that these people weren't even doing it consciously. Part of me fears it's just so ingrained into us that this system of comparison, it just breeds competition and selfish ambition and envy. And it's dangerous. You can't have true community when you're looking at your neighbor and what you see is your competition. That's the first reason. The second reason it's so dangerous is because of what it does to our relationship with God. Look at what happened with these workers. Imagine if these workers who were hired first got paid first. So they worked all day, they got their denarius, they went home, and they never knew what anybody else got. Everything would be fine. The relationship with the landowner would be intact. They'd be happy, they'd probably, be excited to maybe work with the landowner again, and yet simply because they saw that somebody else got something they didn't, They were offended and outraged, and then they grumbled against the landowner. And immediately they saw the landowner as their enemy. There are times where stuff happens in our lives. Stuff happens to us. There are situations that no matter how hard we try, we just can't escape. And when we compare our lives to other people's and we ask God, why are you doing this to me? Why not them? And we challenge God in this way. It creates this barrier between us and God. We start to see God as the enemy. I have some people in my life, people who I'm close to, who they believe there's a God, but they can't actually get around to liking him because they're just so mad at him. They just feel like he's been such a jerk in their life, and they feel like he owes them or something. And they can't forgive God for what he's done. And maybe that's where you're at. Maybe you have been reluctant to commit to God because you feel like he just doesn't value you. And maybe you're not that extreme, but maybe you are here doing the church thing and you love God because you know you're supposed to, and you know that he loves you, but there is still a tension that's there because you feel like he just doesn't value quite as much as some of these other people. If we don't feel like God values us, we're going to treat him as the enemy. And it's going to create this tension in our relationship with God. And maybe this isn't you at all. Maybe you're on the other side of the spectrum where you say, you see somebody come in and you see they have something that you don't have. You're like, oh, he has the nice car, but I'm a better person. Or you see, oh, she might have that body, but I'm so much smarter than she is. Or you see that, this person has happy, healthy kids, but you're like, but I'm actually a better parent than they are. And maybe you're the type of person that when you compare yourselves to other people, you feel great. Maybe you're the kind of person that thinks that this system of comparison is working out in your favor. Because every time you measure up against somebody else, you walk away like, all right, I'm doing pretty good for myself. But this system is still dangerous, and it's still not part of God's economy, not part of God's kingdom. Because if we're finding our value in this system, then it's only feeding into our pride and our ego, and this is just as destructive to our relationship with others, and it's just as destructive to our relationship with God. Jesus says this value system based on comparison, it's not part of the kingdom economy. And so what we have to do is we have to embrace our kingdom value. It's the only way to move past this system of comparison. We can't just ignore our desire to be valued. You have value. We have to find out what our kingdom value is. And because value is always comparative, it still has to be based on something. There's still a comparison that needs to play out. But in the kingdom economy, God isn't comparing you to the person next to you. In the kingdom economy, God is comparing you to his son. And that might sound scary because Jesus is awesome and perfect, but bear with me. There are times where the boys, my brothers, got to do certain things, and I would plead with my parents so vigorously that my parents would eventually cave, because it's hard to say no to your kid when they're just begging like that. And so they would cave and they let me go and do this. Well, there was a night where God's son was on his knees in a garden. He was begging his father. He's crying out to him so aggressively that tears of blood were streaming down his face. And he's just pleading with him that God could change the situation. And in that moment, God held the life of his son in one hand and your life in another. And he looked down at his own son who's crying out, and God chose you. He chose you. This is where your true value comes from. It's not how you compare to the person sitting next to you. It's how you compare to God's Son, and God chooses you. If you believe this, then you know that there's nothing you can do to add to that value. And if you believe this, and you know there's nothing that you can do to take away from that value. When Lindsay and I got married, at the end of our wedding ceremony, the minister who married us, who's a close friend and mentor of mine, he turned to both of us at the very end of the ceremony, and he said, first to Lindsay, he said, "Lindsay, out of all the people in the world, Trevor chose you." And he said, "Trevor, out of all the people in the world, Lindsay chose you." And he turned to both of us and he said, "Never lose the wonder of that. Never lose the wonder of that." 2,000 years ago, God had to make a choice. And he looked down at his Son, and he looked down at you, and he chose you. Never lose the wonder of that. As we embrace our true kingdom value, it gives us the freedom to stop comparing ourselves to other people and to engage them in a productive way, to have a true sense of community with one another, and to pour into our relationship with God. God chose you. Never lose the wonder of that. Let's pray. God, we thank you for bringing us to this place, ordering our lives and our steps in such a way that we're here now, standing before you, knowing that we aren't just your employees, or we aren't just your servants, God, but you've called us your children. God, you paid an enormous, enormous price for us. And in your economy, we are worth everything to you. God, I pray that we will never lose the wonder of that. That truth will sink deep into our hearts and into our minds, so that we can be free from this need to compare ourselves, to try to measure up, to see what's going on in somebody else's life and judge what's going on in our own lives. God, we know how valuable we are. And there's going to be ups and downs in our lives, God. But may we never question how much you love us and how much you care for us. Thank you for all these things. In Jesus' name, amen.